meeting is being recorded.
So I just reshared my screen, and then can anybody see the screen right now that I'm sharing? Um, if not, you can also I have also posted this on Google Classroom, so you can use that as well. So what the idea really is as we talked about, this idea of self-ownership. So what does it mean to be a libertarian? It's really that you have the rights to control yourself. And that is the most important thing. And the other ones, as we see, enforcement and compensation rights, or some of the other rights as stated, are really just kind of the gist that they follow, right? It's really this kind of absolute control that you have, this kind of a freedom that you should be granted. So as we go on to the second idea, really, we focus really as much as you can on the idea of self-ownership, that one person fully own themselves. And that is the most important thing in the logic. So we're just going to go over one of the logic that was used. So can we kind of go over, as we see slide 3, and then there was this second point there about self-ownership. Can anybody tell me what Nozick was focusing on? What kind of is his point here? So does anybody want to answer that? If not, I'll just talk a little bit more about what Nozick was thinking. All right, then. So the idea that Nozick was focusing on, right? The case he used really is to think about the idea of tax, right? So we use the idea of redistributed taxation. What that basically means is that so in this case, the government can collect a certain amount of tax to ensure certain, say fairness in general for society. But what Nozick was arguing was that this was using the logic of self-ownership. If you really do take taxes because of this reason, because of redistributive justice or whatnot, you're really taking away their labor. And basically by doing that, this is by collecting taxes in that way, it's similar to forced labor or slavery. Does anybody have a comment on that, or what do you guys think? What do you think about Nozick's logic? Do you think it's right? Do you think it's wrong? You can put it in chat. You can just speak up if you want to say anything. If not, I'll just keep going. So what the idea that Nozick was really arguing is a complete sense self-ownership, right? So if you own yourself, you can choose freely to give money to other people, this system, but you should not be able to coerce by the government, because if they do that, it will be, as he said, forced labor or slavery. But what I would like to say is that his logic is among one of the more extreme version of libertarianism. All libertarianism are not like him, so I would just like to clarify that. But let's focus on the other ideas that was really here, right? So you can certainly, what is theory? about justice, right? Fundamentally, what can you do in this case? Really, one is that people respect people, and respect their decisions, and so on and so forth. And the other one is really that, well, you could endorse certain things if you want to, but other than that, it's a bit different. So I want to focus a little bit more on the idea of right and wrong under, the idea of full self-ownership. So what do you say, using this logic? What would rape or, or slavery be, right or wrong under that circumstances? Basically the idea of ownership. Does anybody want to answer that? Okay, Catherine, why would it be wrong?
Because his point is like saying that you have a right to yourself and you're not supposed to like if you or wait, what was it again? If you like make someone a slave, you're making them do labor and stuff.
Yes, right. When you're a slave, you don't get to control, what you want, right? You don't get to control yourself, and you also don't get to have fundamental freedom, control over your body. So because of that reason, slavery is wrong. But in other instances, in which we talk about something that is voluntary, right? So if you want to, say box with another person, right? If you, agree to a boxing match that, you consented, then it would not be wrong. Or in other instances. So that would be some of the justification under that, right? So the same thing with rape, because you fundamentally involves, in somebody else's body, or against their will, but not because there's something fundamentally wrong with the action itself, as stated there. And the other question I think here is that there's a significance of moral, or basically you get to have a lot of personal freedom if you do believe in libertarianism in general. So sometimes people categorize libertarianism as people who are right wing. That is not true, right? Because some of the people on the right strand might say that we're against abortion, but if you see this kind of philosophical foundation for libertarianism, which values, this kind of self-ownership. Under this logic, I think, cases like abortion would be permitted. It's just the philosophical justification for that, I think, would reasonably fall into line with that. It's nothing to do with political orientation. It's just a fact that I think I have to clarify before I move on. So I want to ask you guys a question. Should we have, seatbelt laws, and the why, right? Or why not in this case? Using libertarianism, this idea about this personal freedom. Catherine, go ahead.
I feel like there probably wouldn't be any seatbelt laws because you're
Hello?
technically. Oh, can you hear me?
Oh yeah, I can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I feel like there probably wouldn't be any seatbelt laws because you're kind of supposed to be in control of your own body, and it is like a safety measure. But the thing is, like if you like don't have a seatbelt, I guess you could also cause harm to other people if you're in the car with other people. So it's kind of yeah.
Yeah, I think Catherine's right on this, right? So the question that we see here, especially in the question of libertarianism, is really that seatbelt laws might be a very good idea, right? It might be a very good idea. It might be safer, but of course, liberty comes first. So then the question is whether or not that people would consent to seatbelt law. right? So if they do, or a great majority do, then maybe that it should be permitted, right? But if that's not the case, if the people did not voluntarily say that this is what we want, then of course you would not have seatbelt law. And I think that's just a general idea of libertarianism in this context, especially on that. So one of the questions about this logic, right? Think about it this way, right? If we think about this fundamental idea of liberty, right? In one sense, it poses the question of voluntary servitude or voluntary slavery, right? It generally did not really happen that often, but you can certainly trade yourself as a slave if that is kind of the idea of liberty here, right? Because you can use your own body freely as you wish, and you are the own agent that do that. And then possibly then it's possible that the voluntary slavery could happen. But again, I think this really differs on what the person's view on libertarianism is, right? So even if you are a libertarian, you might have a very different view on liberty, and specifically what kind of liberty that you have in different circumstances, right? So even in the case of voluntary slavery, you could say, if you're against it, you could definitely have a reason for that. You could simply state that in this case, you would still not be free, even though you could say that you might be, even though if you consent to it, there might be an element of coercion in that consent, right? So there, I think it's a great deal of other factors that comes into that. But again, I think the other question that we have, right, is really the idea of common good, right? About more or less the utilitarian logic that we have talked about before. And what that actually means is that, let's say we have a context in which we can save 10 innocent lives by gently punishing one person. And under libertarianism, it would seem that you would choose liberty over a consequence. So then you would not be able to say punish one person to save the lives of 10 people. That would not be an option because you violated the other people's freedom, and that is not acceptable in a libertarian logic. Some people would say that interpretation is correct, but I guess that there will be some people who will interpret libertarianism maybe in a slightly different way. But that's kind of the general idea of what libertarianism actually means. And I guess the concerns, that will be another one, is really I guess there's basically this objection to self-ownership, right? And can anybody read the last paragraph and tell me what they think about that section? Um, so really, I guess the question in that is, actually, can you see the slide I'm presenting now? The one about another concern, the counterintuitive nature of libertarianism, especially on the idea of self-ownership. I guess what it really means is that there is lack of flexibility in that logic, right? So you cannot distinguish between a minor infringement or major infringement of liberty, right? So even if basically it doesn't really matter that the infringement upon the liberty is minor or major, because the logic goes you cannot violate any. So that's why people would say that it's just not workable. It's just not practical. If you value, minor infringement as much as you value major infringement, that's why libertarian logic of self-ownership is difficult to comprehend in actual life. And the other question is really, I guess we talk about the power to appropriate, to say appropriation, and also to talk about the idea of justice and especially in this case, uh, distributional justice, distributive justice. And we do you guys want to go over each point and just give me kind of general reflection on what you think? Because if it's just me talking, I think it would not be very helpful. And I think I'll just finish the lecture then. I guess even though I guess libertarian distributional justice, say you change the amount of taxes that somebody should pay to give it to maybe another person for maybe a just, a right, moral issue, but that would not be necessarily the case in libertarians thinking. It really has whether or not that people have rightfully acquired what they have, right? So what that actually means is that whether or not that they have gained their wealth through legitimate ways, which we'll talk about a bit later on, but that's kind of the general idea here. And then we can expand a little bit more on the idea of original accusation. And then basically that the idea is really if you went to a place and that some objects was not owned by anyone at all, and then you after a while you don't have to say ask the permission of government specifically to gain the property itself. So that was really a bit more on the Locke, John Locke and his thinking. And then I guess really we're going to talk a little bit more about Locke later on in this section. About specifically what are actually some of the other most important factors that you would take into consideration of implementing this kind of a logic. And Locke was thinking something very similar to what the idea of original acquisition was. So you can say that Locke, to support partly of that, things like enclosed land, in Locke's view, should be considered other people's property, and so on and so forth. And then we're going to talk a bit more about consent and legitimacy. Basically, that libertarians are generally skeptical of political authority. They don't necessarily. I guess the question here is really they want a great deal of acceptance for I guess the idea here we talk about is really consent, and as we know, because they value liberty so much, it's not difficult to imagine that they are skeptical of government or state, right? In many cases, they would talk a little bit more. They would, of course, infringe upon the rights of the people in some instances for different reasons. And then the idea really is to say, things like the other section about legitimacy, right? So if you do punish people for, self-regarding conduct, right? So like drugs, or, refusing to purchase health insurance, these things, they are basically violated. The people's rights are violated by states. And can we see why that is understandable to the logic that they use? Because the logic is fundamentally a libertarian one, right? So it really is about, taking self-ownership of your body. So whether or not you take drugs is really your own decision. It should not be, managed by a state. And so on and so forth, right? So religion is the same deal, right? You should not have anybody regulating religion for the same reason, because you have control over yourself and you can determine what you want. So this is, I guess, this is a philosophical foundation one. So so again, we refer back to the idea of right, the kind of idea of against abortion, and kind of the law and order narrative that they have, was not necessarily associated with at least the philosophical idea of libertarian. And then we're going to move on a little bit more about anarchism, because I would say it's a bit similar, right? So can we read the quote from Bakunin, and tell me what you guys think about what he's saying? So Bakunin is basically saying that in a government, there will always be a dominating class of citizens, and therefore there will be slavery. And that is why he's fundamentally against any government. The other one is really, the other section is really understanding of the basic principles as to how it got started and a general idea of that. The idea really is just to rule by no one. And then we're just going to move on to the next section. So though you would see that there will be a lot of different basically sections of what anarchism would be. There will be cultural ones, there will be political ones, and there will be philosophical ones. All very, I would say, distinguished from each other to a certain respect. They are, at least to a certain extent, different. So one is really political anarchist. They often destroy illegitimate states. If they see it as illegitimate, they would, basically take action to destroy those states. And then the other one is really more about a philosophical foundation, would be about political action, obligation, and obedience, and also, ethical reflection. These will be the reason why that, in a philosophical sense, why you would overthrow any government, which is a bit different from political ones. Political ones would be a little bit more arbitrary, but the other one's a bit more reflective in that sense. So, and the other one is really about the idea of obligation, as we talked about in the previous one. So it really seems to him that the idea really is very difficult to see. Basically, if you want to seek autonomy, freedom, or liberty, there will be really no states whose subjects have a moral obligation to obey its command, right? So basically, you would not have to follow a state's, I suppose, law in this case. And then the next section here, basically, in that sense, it will be legitimate. And I guess really, if you see that, is that also there will be a consideration of approval and also support. That would also be conventional as to whether or not that these ideological concept will be put into place, I guess. I guess this is really what I've planned so far. Do you guys really understand the kind of the logic of anarchism and also the idea or the general idea of libertarianism? Go ahead, Catherine.
I feel like, okay, like I kind of get them, but I feel like their connection isn't exactly concrete because you have to kind of decide how you interpret it. Because if you go like 100% on the anarchist and libertarian route, if you I feel like it kind of gets to an extent where you start being selfish because if there is no regulation or governmental authority, there really isn't anything to stop you from like killing somebody, even if it's for your own good. So I feel like anarchism should be like it's kind of like democracy but without order. But like I feel like having a government would be better if it does go with libertarianism.
Yeah, I think this is definitely a part of that, right? You can see that there is a variation between specifically what the idea of libertarian and anarchists, where they would go, right? So libertarian, they would not. It depends on what context it is, right? Again, it really is about interpretation, and specifically, even in the idea of libertarianism, you would have left-wing libertarianism, right? You would have left-wing and right-wing libertarians, and those interpretation can differ. And whether or not having a government is important, I guess really rests on the issue of security, and general prosperity. And it's possible that if you do have the greatest uh, amount of autonomy, that you would not want to hurt anybody. It's possible, but in that case, there will be no ruling class, right? But again, it really depends on how you think about it, right? Resources are definitely something that would be taken into consideration. But again, these ideals are not as practical as what we talked about before, right? Utilitarianism is simple in the sense that there is a concrete thing there, right? There's kind of the idea really is this kind of a I guess you could say moral difference between them, right? Because utilitarianism, in one sense, is really you care about the consequence, and that's it. That's the only thing that matters in moral. And now you have a very different strand of thinking about moral that really depend on the persons. And you don't have a particular obligation, and you have a tremendous amount of freedom to decide, even cases like whether or not we take drugs or not. Generally, that would be considered as something moral to do. And I guess that's pretty much it for this class. Do you guys have any more questions? I'd like to see a bit more of a discussion, like we had in the last class, kind of a scenario. If not, I'll just end the meeting here. And I'd like to thank you very much for taking this class, and have a wonderful day.